Hi everyone, welcome to the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center's Fire Right Now Instagram live stream, Unpacking Racial Politics and the Election. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Clarke Kaplan and I'm the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. For those of you who haven't tuned in before, our Fire Right Now sequence is a series of Instagram live streams where we try to offer rapid responses from both scholars and organizers to critical issues in racial justice and racial movement building in the United States and transnationally. This is part of the work that ARPC does to bring together scholars, activists, community-based organizers, artists, and policymakers toward intersectional racial justice and decolonial liberation. So with no further ado, I'm going to actually start us off right now with our event. And we've got an exciting group of folks joining us today for a conversation that I think is much needed. I think all have been watching in the news, in social media, in our conversations with friends. There are a lot of hot takes about this election. And interestingly and unsurprisingly, a number of those continue to focus on this notion that really where we need to turn is to communities of color, to parsing voters of color and how they are or are not responsible for the outcome of this election. And at ARPC, one of the things that we have been doing over the last few days, in addition to, I think, like many people, worrying, grieving, resting a little bit after the big push of the election, one of the things that we've been doing is trying to really look at the research, the data, and the information to begin to debunk some of these myths and to instead offer a more critical take on the role of racial politics, gender and sexuality politics, and class politics in the most recent election outcomes. So today, to have us do that work, I've brought together an amazing group of speakers and discussants, and I'm going to take a minute and introduce them one by one, if I'm going to make sure I have everybody on, in alphabetical order. We have Dr. Ernesto Castañeda, who is the professor University's Center of Latin American and Latino Studies and of the Immigration Lab here at AU. Dr. Castañeda will be talking to us especially about the constructions of Latina voters in the wake of the election and how we can really parse this conversation about immigration in this context. Next, we have joining us Dr. Molly Benitez, who is an assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Portland State University and a labor organizer in the Pacific Northwest. And third and finally, we have Frankie Seabron, who is a Black feminist abolitionist organizer and the program manager for Harriet's Wildest Dreams, a grassroots coalition and membership organization in the DC area. I want to thank all of you for joining. So while we are waiting for Ernesto, I'm actually going to start off with a question for Frankie, if that is okay. So let's just sort of start by talking about this kind of hyper-focus recently on Latina and Black voters as a mechanism for explaining Trump's election. I think one of the things that we've seen is when the election, is discussed and exit polls are discussed, there's a profound emphasis on these statistics about how Latina men showed up, voted for Trump at over 50%, the majority of Latina men, and that there was a marked percentage increase in the number of Latina women. We also saw a lot of discussion both prior to the election and after about the increase in Black men voting for Trump. And of course, what we know in reality is that these are really actually very tiny percentages, right? So Black voters as a whole made up 12% of the voters in this election. Latina voters made up 12%. But that's really been the kind of focus, even as we know that, in fact, 60% of white men and 53% of white women voted for Trump, and that they made up 70% combined of the voting population. So if this is our background, how do we talk about this kind of focus on Latina and Black voters as the kind of big takeaway in the mainstream media and mainstream political pundits for explaining the election? Frankie, as a Black feminist, what is your take on that narrative that started even before Election Day about Black men's unwillingness to vote for a Black woman and the kind of invocation of Black men's sexism or misogynoir in relation to the Harris campaign? We even saw, of course, Barack Obama and all these other folks getting out there and chastising Black men, and this narrative that Black men weren't going to support a Black woman candidate. What's your take, Frankie?
Hey y'all, Frankie here. I use she, they pronouns with Harriet's Wildest Dreams. And really, the hyper focus of people saying that one marginalized group is responsible for the election in Trump, and really, if we back all the way up and go into the macro, the way this country is like quickly barreling towards fascism, it is it is the job of white supremacy, right, to make sure that not only are we split into groups, not only are we categorized based upon lines of identity, but that then you hyper focus down, you niche down on those identities, and then in order to place blame. And so what's happening now is what we call lateral or horizontal oppression. One group is pitted against the next group, and we lose the plot. We lose the plot. If the plot for me is liberation, if the plot for me is abolition, we ain't never gonna get free from the ballot box, baby. It's never gonna be that. And so I think back to macro, what we need to really center our folks around is that elections and voting and the way that we work within the system is just one way. It's one tool, right? But getting in our communities, the grassroots perspective, how are we caring for each other? In what ways do you even know your neighbors? And so the real crux of this is, how are we having these conversations with one another? How are we really getting at the root cause of it all, which is the power structure? Power is not going to concede itself. And so when you see the lateral oppression, when you see the whole conversations of Black men being pit against Black women, of certain identities being pit against one another, it is the job of white supremacy to maintain white supremacy. And so instead of us doing the infighting, we have to really be harsh with the systems and be gentle with one another, because we're not all in the same place. We don't have all the same perspectives. So yeah, harsh with the systems, gentle with one another, and really an invitation to have more conversations like this.
I love that phrase. I might have to use it a lot because it's so powerful. And what you just said made me think so much about how we so often talk about, elections, like this kind of liberal idealization of elections as like the true expression of our inner political self and identity. And then afterward, we treat them as if they're tea leaves or Ouija boards that tell us like the true, like how people vote tells us the true political spirit and desires of America in ways that really, I think, act as if the only place where these things are happening is, one day every few years in a ballot box by yourself, as opposed to it really being a symptom or a reflection of an entire political context. Movements, both regressive and progressive movements, coalitions, communities, and material conditions. So I think, you're really putting that in a useful context. And, On that note, just sticking with this for a second further, Frankie, one of the things I'd love to hear you also talk about is how in this realm of kind of focusing on these identities and these voting has been this kind of notion that Kamala Harris losing is really all about this sort of, we'll never elect a Black woman, and this is because she was a Black feminist, and this is a Black feminist campaign. And I think you and I have talked a lot about what the problem is of holding up Kamala Harris's campaign or Kamala Harris herself as any kind of example of what Black feminism in power might look like. So I want to hear what you think.
Yeah, Kamala Harris is not a Black feminist. There's that. I gave a speech at the Women's March last week and was really pulling from the tenets of what Audre Lorde said in her speech. The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. If your feminism doesn't include people who look like me, if your feminism doesn't include the women and girls of Palestine, Sudan, and Congo, if your feminism doesn't include trans women, if your feminism does not include all of the people that it impacts, then is it really feminism? And so to even herald Kamala Harris as being a person who, yes, abortion rights was on the ballot, several states, 10 states to be exact, right? Those the bodily autonomy, the gender affirming care, those things were definitely on the ballot, and she campaigned on those. And there were whole swaths and whole communities and whole tenants that were ignored in this campaign, whole pieces of folks' humanity, when people have to decide, are being asked to decide, am I going to vote for the person who is causing violence in my community, causing violence in my home? That is not a black feminist take. And so again, if we, what people were forced to do was really make a decision that was within the status quo, within the establishment. And I won't say definitively that this country is too racist or too sexist to elect a Black woman as president, but what I will say is that those numbers don't lie. What I will say, if 70% combined of white men and white women voted for Trump, power is not going to concede itself. And I would also argue that I would also argue that Kamala Harris really did not get in and get with the more progressive agenda, the more leftist agenda, the things that we really wanted. And when you do that, you alienate the people who are really going to stand in the gap for you. It was always going to be the establishment. What we had to choose between was the establishment and the establishment. That's it. And people don't want that anymore. We don't want it anymore. We want something that is bigger than that. We want to exist outside of the imaginations of cishet white men. Period.
Exactly.
We got to build something else.
Yeah, and I think that is that possibility of imagining. I think one of the things that you are really pointing to, Frankie, is that, like, even if Kamala Harris could have gotten elected, even if it wasn't that we could, even if we could elect a Black woman, that is not the same as ever electing somebody that is actually committed to the Black feminist politics that say that when Black women are free, then everybody can be free. And when we talk about Black men and the increase in Black men not voting for Trump or not voting for Kamala Harris, I think it's a worthwhile question to ask, that at a time when Black men still make up a massively disproportionate portion of the prison population and the jail population, what does it mean that maybe you don't want to vote for somebody who is actually running on a law and order campaign, right? I mean, so these are the kinds of questions that, that I think we really need to be pushing on. And as long as we're talking about voters' imagination, I want to come back to Ernesto in a minute and talk about the sort of hyper-focus on Latina voters, in particular Latina men, and the kinds of racialized stereotypes that I think are being leveraged here to conceal the complexities of Latina identity. But for right now, Molly, I'd love to actually turn to you for a minute and talk about a different kind of racial imaginary. So we're going to circle back to Ernesto in a minute, but let's talk about this narrative, right, that we keep hearing everywhere. It's not about racism. It's about the white working class, and the white working class are just feeling so much economic, very real economic insecurity, high levels of economic disenfranchisement, the destruction of labor unions, and that's really what it's about, and this is what the elites don't get. But what we also know is that Trump is not running on a white working class, a pro working class platform in any way, shape, or form. So how do we talk about that racial imaginary?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's always missing in the conversation about like, oh, the white working class is white supremacy, right? And this aspiration towards whiteness. If you think about like labor history, we had talked earlier about the wages of whiteness, right? David Rudiger's Wages of Whiteness, and how, in pre-1800s, there was, this time in which like the economic, for non-slave holding states, right, the economic like realities for poor working people were very similar. And because poor Black people and poor white working class people could find similarities, they were actually much stronger together. And so this like rhetorical shift happens where white working class people get to be called freemen, right? Where like they may have the same economic standing, but at least they were free. And this like rhetorical shift, like we watch it move all the way through labor history, where Black working class people and Black poor people are not allowed into the trades, right? So we get early trades unions that don't allow Black men and anybody of color, right? And that shift, like we see all the way through labor history. And at this point, I think the conversation about white supremacy is gone, but the concept is still there, right? That we can at least we're not this other group of people. So like most of, I think that's a huge part of what's missing in this conversation of like who's voting for Trump. And it's not, maybe there's some economic parts in there, but we know that Trump is not supporting unions, is not doing a working class platform. And so really what it is this kind of like aspirational voting to like potentially be, right, part of this upper class, because at least, or like to separate ourselves from this other class of people. And I do think there's like a conversation, there is this conversation that Trump, that people are voting for him not because they relate to his racism or his misogyny, but I don't think that that's true. I work specifically in the trades and in like blue collar trades, and there's a really interesting history of the way misogyny and toxic masculinity is really the foundation of like of this kind of like working class. I'm not saying that all working class and blue collar people are like this, but it is a culture in these fields in which that kind of rhetoric is really upheld and seen as like dominant and strong. And so there's a way in which Trump effectively like relates to these kind of like white working class people and non-white working class people, right? He effectively relates to them. And, I think that that's a big part of it too. But in a way that Kamala Harris cannot, right? And in a way the Democratic Party is almost always seen as like not working class, which, they've done to themselves.
Right. I mean, I think it is one of the things that is most interesting about, one of the things that was really interesting about the sort of lead up to this is that we no longer can even talk about a party of the working class, right? So we have, this kind of moment where once again, we're forced to return to the recognition that these are not the party. These are not the people that will save us, right? This is not the system that actually will address the conditions of economic disenfranchisement, of the destruction of a social network, of the, you know, devaluing of labor and the exploitation of workers both here and abroad, right? Because these are not issues that are central in either of these kinds of dominant electoral political streams. And we saw that in voter turnout. We saw that in the lack of union support for either candidate. And it really points to that need that, as Frankie said earlier, right, for imagining something else, other kinds of coalitions. And so one of the things I want to ask you, Molly, before we return to Ernesto, is, so given some of the very real obstacles that you just pointed out, how do you even begin to think about what that coalition looked like? How do we build cross-racial working class coalitions in the midst of these kinds of entanglements of white nationalism and economic disenfranchisement and white working class identity that are not built on these, you know, as Frankie used, these master's tools, right? These systems of marginalization and hierarchization that are patriarchy.
Yeah, great question. I don't have an answer for that, but I think that you know, unions are great for everything that they do, and they still like fail in many ways to like center Black and brown, disabled, right, workers. And so the other thing that I think like unions are often doing, which is like pushing, right? They're like, we're going to vote for this we're going to push our membership towards this candidate, and that candidate is not speaking, right, for their membership and hasn't, and telling, you know, these like working class people that the world is going to get so much worse if Trump becomes president, and the world is bad, right? They're living these conditions. And so I think like what Frankie's saying, like the electoral politics is not the place for us to make like these coalitions. We need to be doing that like together, community, in relationship. You know, I think maybe the labor movement has a really good space right now because we know that Trump is not pro-labor, and maybe we'll start to see those effects. And this is a really good time for the labor movement to really try to make those coalitions. You know, white supremacy, you know, there, you know, the belief of white working class that they'll like move up, but white supremacy will eat itself to keep itself alive, right? These white working class people, you know, are going to be destroyed. And so like, this is the time to like get that kind of like community and education, and maybe less focus on the electoral politics.
I think that's really such a great point. And I think, you know, in thinking about, right, how white supremacy will eat itself, I want to actually return to Ernesto here because I think this is a really kind of critical conversation. So back to this kind of hyper focus, right? The hyper focus on Latino voters as this kind of marker, right? This kind of like absolute truth, right? That has all of a sudden become revealed about, you know, the conservatism of the Latino voter, which, I mean, I don't know about you, Ernesto, but I'm always like, oh, this is like, they're basically saying everything except for like machismo, right? Like there's this kind of like really troubling kind of set of racial stereotypes that I feel like are always just under the surface. But, you know, this is something that you have been talking about for years, about the ridiculousness with which we understand that the Latino voting community, but also just Latino political organizing and movements and communities that doesn't address the fractures around citizenship, around class, around, you know, relationships to communism, etc. So I want to kind of ask you two questions. I'm going to let you answer them however you want, but I want to ask you, how do we talk in productive, non-divisive ways, critically, about secondary marginalization among Latino communities, which is not new. It is not even close to new. This is something that voters in California showed in 187, and that was resolved, again, not through ballots, but through strong, active community organizing and movement building, right? But how do we talk about the kind of secondary marginalization and the kinds of fractures that shape these kinds of questions among Latina communities, particularly in areas like Florida Georgia and other places. But second, and maybe more importantly for me, I think, that I'd love to hear you talk about is in terms of how Latino communities are being pitted against both other communities of color and also even against each other. And thinking about the structural conditions that are shaping the conditions for Latino political coalitions, what are the conditions for building a broader social movement that can kind of address some of these divisions and antagonisms?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, everyone, and sorry for the delay in joining. This is my first Instagram live, and it shows. But now to answering the questions. I like the framing that the Anti-Racist Policy and Research Center is doing, the ARPC, on questioning this idea that now is becoming hegemonic or becoming a consensus in media analysis that people voted because of real economic concerns. And that was the main issue that Donald Trump won. And I'm glad we're pushing back already. That is problematic. It's hiding other things that we have already touched on. But it's also untrue. So let me touch on that real quick, and then I will talk about the issue of the Latino vote. So I've been saying for the whole coverage of this election, when people are asked, what is your main issue? Again, it's problematic that people are going to vote around one whole idea or policy. It's very reductive, and I don't think even political scientists believe that anymore. But the media coverage is stuck to that a lot. So they emphasize a lot of issues, mainly two issues during the leading to November 5th, to the vote, which was immigration and the economy as top issues of concern, or inflation sometimes was its own option that people could give. And I always say, if you look at the crosstabs of those answers, it was the Republicans driving that salience of those issues. So many of the polls, you will see that 80% of the people saying that migration was the top issue. 80% of those folks were Republicans. The independents were around half and half, and very few people of the Democrats saw that as a main issue, one way or the other. All the polls, they will ask the question of, are you in favor of mass deportations? And then the journalists, some of them Latinos, will be surprised that 52, 54%, a slight majority will be in favor. But the same poll will have another question about whether you are in favor of providing an amnesty, basically, to the people who are here undocumented. And that or higher number of the people in the same answer will say yes, but that didn't make it into the headlines, that didn't make it into the discussion that DACA is very popular, that regularization is very popular. So that was what Kamala Harris was proposing in immigration, kind of controlling the border, providing legal pathways to citizenship, to enter legally, and creating new pathways for citizenship. So that's what the public wants in terms of immigration policy, but it wasn't voted along the lines. Now, for the exit polls, there's problems. They don't poll everybody. If you don't speak English, probably you're likely not going to be answering a poll. If you're a rural community or a poor neighborhood, that's likely to answer the exit polls. Again, taking the exit polls with a grain of salt, but a lot of people are going to go there to analyze these things. So if we look at that, and then it says, okay, for the people that said, what were the top issues? Immigration was only 11% of the voters as their main motivation, the one issue. It wasn't about the immigration, and I've been saying that for years. The journalists thought I was crazy, but most people don't really care about immigration. The MAGA base of Donald Trump cares about immigration because it's a way to say race and exclusion and hierarchy and white. But because it's like a dog whistle to talk about white supremacy without having to say it out loud. So of those people that said that immigration was the number one concern, 90% of them were Republicans. They were not talking to the whole public. We're talking about a particular base. And then the economy, which again now everybody says it's about the economy. It's only 32%, which last time I checked is very, 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 very far away from 50%. So it's not the majority of voters. And again, among those, if we look at the partisanship, it was 80% of the people that say the economy that are Republican. So we are confounding here a narrative driven by the Republican base, which are not asking about whiteness in the survey, that they are saying, oh, we're very concerned about the economy and immigration as an answer that is politically correct, not to say what they don't like the black woman as a potential candidate. So again, the media repeating that, oh yeah, it was the economy stupid. No, it was not. because most people, the price of gasoline is really low right now. I hope that at least half of the electorate will remember that the inflation, a lot of that is caused because of the pandemic, and once in a generation situation. So, and the policies that Trump has proposed, anybody doing a little research, paying a little bit of attention, knows that mass deportation, tariffs to stop there are going to create inflation and an economic problem. So we'll see once we have, if he does those policies and the economy decreases or weakens, we'll see next time around if people are really going to vote for the economy and vote them out of office. It's yet to be seen, but it's not really the economy. State of democracy, it's 34%. Mainly Democrats were worried about it, and it wasn't enough to carry. All right, I'm moving to the who is to blame for this election. And again, it's many people, but the majority of the voters are white, and the majority of the people, the majority of the white vote went for Trump. So there's no question about it. And women, many of us thought that women are going to go harder for Kamala Harris and reflect what we saw in the midterm elections, where because of the abortion issue, a lot of women were repealing initiatives in the South, in the Midwest, and voting very democratically friendly. I thought that was a good prelude to the 2024 election, but I think what happened in those midterm elections or those ballot initiatives is that women were mobilized, women went to vote for that, and a lot of the men didn't care enough and they stayed home. But it's not that they were supportive of some of the men voted for them for sure, but not the majority. And this national election, that was very important in terms of power distribution, the men showed up higher numbers, and the women, the importance of abortion went down as who to choose for president. And you see that they could have their cake and eat it too, because in many states, they voted for initiatives to give some rights back to women having trouble during pregnancy, while still voting for Trump. So they could differentiate. I think we're too extreme on abortion here, but still, I prefer this guy. So again, that's something that complicates the issue of gender, or actually says that race is more important than gender for white women in a majority. There's a division between the urban and the rural, or maybe a little lesser than we thought. And the college educated indeed, and particularly people who were more than college education voted majority Democrat, but still a big chunk, over 40% of people with a college degree, 45 of people with BAs voted for Trump. We're doing a mistake. That's why the center is important and this type of discussions, because even people that graduated from college didn't get a racial literacy education. They still don't understand these dynamics that we're talking about today. Some of it is self-designed. Some people graduated a long time ago. But I think even people that graduated recently, because all of the young vote went to Republican, they were not understanding the lesson, or they were pushing back against it, which is something that a lot of people are saying. And I'm not to justify it, but I think we have to ask whether the discussions we have sometimes are too academic and too avant-garde for the working class. There's some research that some political scientist colleagues did. I don't want to over-dimension it, but people in the media already caught on it really fast. And they're saying that in those experiments and surveys, that the people that when they heard statements by candidates, whether they were Latino or not, using the term Latinx, that a lot of people were pushing back. And again, this is politicized. It is true that farm workers and you tell me, in Oregon, in California, in the West, or anywhere in Florida, they don't use that term. And when you bring it to them, it's a little bit like, who are you? So again, there's been that attack which is going to be taken to the stream. It wasn't the main cause, but it is indeed a disconnect with the college and the non-college educated, and it creates polarization within the college populations, as we see very often. So again, a big problem for many of us here. Now, bring quickly answering the second question about the Latino population. Now, the new cliché is that it's an heterogeneous population. It's always been. It's not new. It's good that people are understanding, so there's not such a thing as a Latino vote per se. But, and then we have Cuban, which is a small portion of the electorate and is more concentrated, and they're not powerful as we want to think they are. They sell themselves very well because they're concentrated. They have one issue, which is the relationship with Cuba. that has really dominated. They were the only nationality group within the Latinos. They were the only group that in majority voted for the Republicans. All the other Latino groups, a majority of them voted for the Democrats, and a majority of Latinos still voted for the Democrats. There was indeed a decrease in the number of Latinos that supported the Democrats, and some people seem offended by that. They are racializing the Latinos. They're all the same, and they should have racial solidarity. And they are making comparisons with the African American votes that the Democrats have taken for granted for a long time. And I like Harriet's answer about that when they were asking her about the supposed huge decrease in black men. It went down, but still, I think only 12% of them voted for Trump. So it's black women and then black men. It should not be blamed at all for the victory of Trump. The opposite. They were the only ones that can hold the fort. But they're still being blamed. And then Latinos are still higher than the white groups and other groups, but they're still being blamed for that decrease. And again, kind of emphasizing this homogeneity. And it's very dangerous that me and other colleagues posting on this on social media, we see that a lot of Democratic voters, those supposed liberals, progressives, are already saying a phrase that is very interesting because they say, okay, I hope the people that voted for Trump, they get deported and then see what they got for. I understand the feeling, I understand the emotion, I know we're angry, but that's a misunderstanding of the population, right? If you're undocumented, you cannot vote. Only Trump believes that, and it's not true. It doesn't happen. So if you're deportable, in the most sense, you're not a citizen. So you cannot vote. You cannot vote for Trump and be deported legally. Well, he wants to take away the citizenship of people and the citizenship of the kids of immigrants. So maybe he could make it happen, but there's not really a lot of.
Let me just
there's
take 1 second, because I think that's just such an important point to kind of go back to Frankie and Molly's point about white supremacy here, right? Because part of what this really does is it requires us to recognize how incredibly powerful white supremacist narratives are, even within communities, across communities of color and white communities, right? Like that racialization of Latino folks in the US as always non-belonging, as always able to be deported, as always able to be punished with this kind of ethno-nationalist, like policing, detainment, expulsion, right? That language is absolutely the language of white supremacy being leveraged, as Frankie pointed out, in a kind of horizontal oppression, right? In this kind of pitting against each other in a way that is, I think, so incredibly, both obviously a misunderstanding, but a misunderstanding rooted in white supremacist notions of Latino folks as always immigrant outsiders and always criminal and illegal and not legitimately part of the U.S. ostensibly white national body. So I think that's an important point to really think about that you're bringing to us. So tell me more about coalitional possibilities. What can we do here, right? Thinking about this kind of moment and thinking about exactly what you just pointed to, where I think all of us have seen these kinds of horizontal oppression. What are the possibilities for building cross-racial coalitions and even intra-community coalitions for change with and among Latino voters, given the heterogeneity of the community?
Is that for me or for who?
That's for you.
Okay.
That's for
okay.
You, sorry.
I'll thank you, Sara. So I think there's a lot of misinformation that has been propagated on purpose. There's been some people with ideological or religious agendas that have really courted the Latino vote for a long time and have been able to flip their ideologies and their vote. So I think we have to present the facts. The facts are on our side, on a more progressive side. So first of all, that immigrants pay taxes, and most people that have come in the last years are asylum seekers, so they are not illegal. I just had a conversation earlier with a person from Colombia who now directs the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, repeating all these anti-immigrant lies. She's benefiting personally with a nice job and some influence, while she's demonizing people from her community. It's not such a thing. But other people that speak Spanish, recent arrivals, or having here for 10, 20, 30 years, or the children. So first of all, it's bending the trauma that a lot of people feel for having to come to the U.S. illegally. That is not their fault. That is the legal system system that for a lot of folks that are working class, non-professionals, etc., there's very few avenues to come here legally or to bring your family legally. And that's not about people and not their fault. It is the legal system, and it's not a criminal act in itself. We have to educate the larger population about that, but also Latinos that came here legally, and Latinos who sometimes internalize this guilt and shame. So there has to be a lot of healing within the community that we're happy to talk in Spanish with each other or to talk about our ancestors from parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we know that a lot of things bring us together. Don't let the status, immigration status of also our parents divide us, but actually make it something secondary. And again, we were very useful for a very, very successful for a lot of years, or it was very, very loud, the immigrant rights movement that had this coalition across blacks, whites, Jews, Asians, etc., documented, undocumented, trying to create a better working class and rights for everybody, a stronger democracy. That was the way to go, but that movement weakened for a lot of reasons, and we're going to have to talk about that. But we have to kind of leave that solidarity and say that it's in nobody's interest to have undocumented people, and the solution is not to get rid of them. They're part of our communities and our labor force, etc. The best easy way is just to give them rights, give them papers. Hopefully they'll earn a bit more money, and it helps everybody. So a lot of education, but going against the grain.
Yeah, I think education is key. I really, one of the things that I know that Frankie, you and I talked about that I really wanted to go back to is, we talked about this from a different angle, Frankie. It's thinking about this kind of question of how do you build coalitions in this moment? Particularly, how do you build coalitions when people feel betrayed? How do you build coalitions in these kind of moments of horizontal oppression? What's your take on some of these questions, some of these issues?
Yeah, I think today we've done a really good job of saying white supremacy, but not always naming how it shows up and what is wrapped up in that. When these conversations, they have to be accessible. It has to be that people understand what we're talking about in the first place. And white supremacy is racial capitalism. White supremacy is the patriarchy. All of those levers that uphold the whole thing that this country was built upon. The country was built by and for cis heterosexual white men, and in order to kind of gain access or get into whiteness, all of these other marginalized groups then bend and mold to become a part of that. So parts of your identity you will let go of or distance yourself from, so that you can get as close to whiteness as possible, as close to that success with that American dream, right? And so in this moment, when we're talking about coalition building, when we're talking about being in spaces with people who are closer, in close proximity to whiteness, we also have to have the conversation about how white supremacy is predicated on anti-Blackness, and how when we show up in these spaces, when Black women show up in these spaces, when we show up to not only organize our communities, but organize all of these other folks, there is real harm that happens just by being in the vicinity. So not only do we need to, we gotta have folks get their folks together, and when they got their folks together, then we can come to the table. Because what I'm not gonna do is then put myself on the line all the time and harm myself. But if I don't show up, then that lens is missing. Then you don't have the abolitionist lens, and you don't have the Black feminist lens, and then y'all motherfuckers flailing in the wind. Oops, I don't know if I can say that on live, but and I want to talk about that. How Black women are showing up in this moment, and that is, they're tired. Black women are tired, even with the elite capture of having the Kamala Harris's. It's still imperialism, just in blackface, right? It's just in womanhood, right? But even that, it's like, damn, we can't even get a symbol, we can't even get a crumb. But we, like, if you look at the numbers, and I'll go back to that. Look at the numbers. The Black folks did their jobs, and like our liberation is tied to each other. Yes. Our liberation, the only way we really gonna get free, because Black folks can vote till we blue in the face. We voted almost 100%, and yet, y'all, we still have to build across. We have to build across sector. We have to build across issue, and we have to build beyond identity, and not ignore identity, not ignore it, because our Lord again said, it is the difference. It is our difference when we're building across lines of difference that we can see it all. And it's that Black queer feminist lens that we use when we look at the world, because that allows us to see all the gaps. It allows us to see everything that's missing. And so what I will say right now, y'all gotta give Black women some grace, a whole lot of grace, right? Because we've been carrying this for a long time, and organize your communities, talk to your folks, and remember that electoral politics is only one way, and that's only how we work within the system. How are we working outside of the system? How are we working outside of academia? How are we in our communities? How are we making the information accessible? That's language justice, that is disability justice, that is all of the intersections of all of the margins. You got to think about it all. And there have to be experts from those fields. And it's not enough to just have the people at the table, but also listen to people's experiences, listen to their lived experiences. And that's what I got.
Okay, I love it. And I want to actually add on, first of all, thank you, because I've been walking around for days being like, these MFers, like, yet again, like, they are blaming us because we can't save them from themselves. Like, what is this thing where we are constantly, like, why are Black people especially supposed to, especially Black women, supposed to save everybody else from themselves? Like, we cannot do that work. But I want to go back to this thing that you just said, Frankie, right? Aside from the healing and the rest that needs to happen, the turning away from the electoral politics here for a minute and talking about what does it mean to go back to community struggles and to invest right now and right here. I want to actually do a rapid fire here. So I teach undergrads, and I teach undergrads who are like, well, what do we do now? A lot of them, this is the first time they have voted, and they have been raised to believe that this is where they make their political difference. And that is obviously, we know, not the way that this works. So what are some ways that we need to talk about across the board, right? Like, how do we reinvest? How do we begin to identify the points of coalition, the opportunities for building these movements and these connections? Because we know that when these campaigns, racial capitalist campaigns to discipline and punish BIPOC folks, racialized immigrants, and poor folks of color, when they are implemented, they actually affect everyone adjacent to them, right? It actually is so incredibly devastating and destructive of the very white working class that is finding themselves in Trump, right? Or in, let's be honest, all of the political regression and backlash over the last 4 years, right? All this sort of post-2020 intense political regression. So what do we build? Like, how do we begin to identify? I'm going to go to Molly first. How do we identify? Molly's like, what? How do we identify some of the points where we build these connections, not through like theory and talking, but through actual practice of movement, of community building?
Yeah, everything you said. I also teach undergrads, and I teach a lot about like organizing and activism. And the thing that I always come back to with them is community and relationship building is how we get anywhere, right? We get nowhere by ourselves. It's always community and relationship building. And I always work, because I think one of the problems is we don't talk about white supremacy, right? When we talk about white supremacy, it's imagined as just like a thing about like white people and not a concept that so many people buy into. And so, you know, with my students, we talk about like the different characteristics of white supremacy and the way that they're embedded in so many of us, so that we can see the way white supremacy like works in our everyday lives. And one of the things white supremacy wants is for us to be individualized, for us to be alone, right? It does not want to have community because we're strong. So the very bare minimum that I tell my students is build community and relationships with everybody around you. If you tell my students, if you look around and you look at a photo of you and your friends and you all look the same, something is wrong, right? You need to be building across like vast different amounts of people, right? Your community cannot just be you. That's like the very base of how we start is community and building.
Well, I guess. Okay, Ernesto, I want to hear from you. And then we actually have a question in the chat that I want to make sure that we give a chance to get answered. I actually can't see the chat because I'm actually talking to you all. But I'm going to get the question in the chat in a second. But Ernesto, you give me a short answer on, what do we do to actually do the groundwork? I think you really started that when you were talking about the kind of healing, the issue of language, right? Tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, it's very tempting, right? We're more exhausted. I completely agree with that. So we have to take a bit time to press, to be sad, to recharge batteries. But then it's tempting for minorities to say, okay, we were proven wrong. They want the power. If there's, we should face ourselves, go back to our shells. But that would be exactly what they want, right? So we should start giving them the power, the voice, or self-censure, because then it increases the risk of fascism. So we have to keep what we're doing, what we love, be with the people we love, and have more joy about it. So very quick, no, don't self-censor, organize, don't by yourself, stay with others, and have the hope or the soul that 46 or so of people didn't vote for him and are very upset about it. You are not a minority. A lot of people didn't care to vote or didn't vote on Trump for many reasons. They are also not supporting Trump necessarily. And the youth and the people that couldn't, the people that had to go to vote, they don't vote. So again, even though Trump clearly voted for Republicans, they're still in the numerical minority. So let's not forget that. And then when people are afraid about what may happen with mass deportation, political enemies, etc. But we were very successful with the separations to stop him. The media spoke, people spoke, they were marching on that, and he went back on that. So we have to keep doing that. A lot of his followers on borders said, oh, he's not serious, he's not really do that. So also hold them to the fight. Hey, you say you voted for him because you're a Christian, blah, blah, blah. You're doing these things that don't go to your values, so you're going to do something about it. Or you said you want the economy to get better, he's doing this, that is not going to happen. Are you going to speak up? So again, we shouldn't give up on people to vote for him. Now, they want some of the things that are true, some things similar to what we do. So it's how we make it happen, not in this administration, but in the midterm and long term. Thank you.
Love this. Okay, I'm going to add my take on this because I can tell I can't resist. But, one of the things that I think is exciting is, sort of this idea of not censoring, connected with what Molly and Frankie are pointing to, is that, we're really talking about what the difference is between seeing power back to those who already have it versus finding new avenues and forms of power that reject the idea that the normative notions of power are the only place. And I'm thinking a lot about, some of the things I've been thinking, reading, and going back to is the idea of, we did our Farm Bill series. We had this incredible Black feminist policy scholar, April Love, who was talking about how important it is for us to recognize the grassroots movements on the right have been incredibly effective at mobilizing multiple tools at the same time. That it is never simply grassroots organizing, it is never simply working through, kind of courts, it is never simply pushing ballot measures and city council measures. I will say, by the way, Harriet is a really great example of these kinds of multifaceted strategies and tactics that keep in mind the multiple ways that power can work, always rooted in community-based movement. But we have to be willing to do the same thing. Right? The reason that we've seen these kinds of successes in this kind of, particular areas of elite capture, in fact, precisely, is because of working on multiple levels on the far right. And I've been incredibly excited to think about what it would mean to be able to bring together folks who are willing to work through the courts, willing to work through things like labor strikes, right? Shutdowns. We saw how effective the airport shutdowns were in giving space for political intervention when it came to the Muslim bans, right? That it wasn't enough to fight in the courts, that we had to first fight in the streets. We saw how effective informal networks for abortion funds have been to cover the gap for folks, right? We know that we have to work on multiple fronts and that we have incredible examples in our communities of not just organizations, but mutual aid societies, groups of friends, off-grid communities who have been doing these kinds of multifaceted, multi-strategy organizing for years, for generations, right? I mean, I'm an old school second generation lesbian. I think about the, lesbians of color and the radical lesbians doing kind of organizing across multiple fronts when I was not even born. So that's my take. I want to reach out to Shelby B for our last question, then I'm going to let you go. Shelby B wanted to know about the difference between Republicans and Democrats, and I think this is a bit of a trick question for this panel. And Shelby's asking that, they've heard the difference between the Republican and the Democratic Party is that Republicans reach from the place of ideology, and the Democrats reach from the place of identity. And is it true that Democrats need more ideology ingrained in their political reach? I'm going to go to Frankie first because I am dying to hear your take on this.
You really want to hear my take on this? Okay. How can I put this best? Shelby, out of electoral politics, girl, and get into the community. That's honestly my take. My take on it is that, it's not where I am right now. It's not where I am right now to really sit and go, like, what type of fascism do you want? Do you want it this way or do you want it that way? What type of status quo do you want? Like, I've already come and identified for myself and my community that whether or not, like, I put them in this bucket or that bucket, neither one is going to get us to freedom. Neither one is going to get us to liberation. So however you package it, however you put them, it's really not going to get us to where there's true equity, there's where we have the access, we have economic freedom. And so it doesn't really serve me to be like, oh, they're this or that type when they're not serving my communities.
Thank you. Anyone else want to take a stab at Shelby's question, Molly? Yeah.
I really love this question, mostly because I think that there's this understanding that whiteness is not an identity category, right? We're always told that the Democrats lean towards identity politics and that the Republicans don't, but the Republicans are doing identity politics. They're still white, cis, right, male, like all of that, hetero, identity politic, right? And somehow we've been able to shift the conversation so that it's like the one more category and thinks as identity is. It is 100% identity politics, right? And so, like, I don't think that there's necessarily a difference. I always think of those memes, where like the bomb is dropping, the Republicans are dropping a bomb, and the Democrats are dropping a bomb with a rainbow flag on it. Like it's kind of like we're both moving towards fascism. Like, who can get us there faster is really like the question. And I 100% agree with Frankie. Like, our liberation is not a system. It's with each other.
My last take on this is, Shelby, one of the things I want to point out is anytime somebody tries to juxtapose ideology and identity, beware, because what they're really trying to do is replicate that thing where ideology means whiteness, right? The people who think and have ideas and have reason, civilization, like big thought and philosophy, and identity means people of color.
Yeah.
And who are just
the personal is political, Shelby. The personal is political.
Exactly, and that's what I was going to say. What I want to remind you is that the idea of identity politics, which we all want to slam up and down and back and forward all the time, came from the brilliant Black feminist, often queer women of the Combahee Collective, whose entire point was that their ideology, their political practice, and their approach to producing change on all fronts, their entire model sophisticated model of interlocking oppressions that we now still talk about in all these different words and frameworks came out of their identity, their positionality, their perspective on the world, that is where the personal is political. Not because we're looking at our goals and like thinking about our own personal identity, but because the ways that we experience power are how we come to understand it and answer back to it. And that is, in fact, what real ideology is, right? Is how we understand power and answer back to it. And that is absolutely always shaped by our positionality, our experiences, material conditions we face, and the communities in which we're rooted, and the histories we draw on. And don't let anyone tell you that that is not the case for every single person, or that is bad, because that's what has saved us so far. Okay, any last takes?
One more.
Gotta say.
I just want to put people in and a little rapid fire. So if you want to do more unlearning and unlearning, you want to learn about abolition, organizing, things like that, Harriet Streams is having an info session next Wednesday. Come and talk through things. We can unpack things. We just work in different ways. We are an abolitionist community defense hub. That means we do legal defense. We are in the courts, watching the courts every single week. We do policy work. We are knocking down council members' doors, y'all. And we do mass mobilization and direct action, marching in the streets. So it is multi-tactic, so many different strategies. There is place and space for movement for everyone. And so if you try to get down with the get down, come see us next Wednesday. It's going to be online, and follow Harriet Streams for more information.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we will look for you guys. Usually post your sessions online, and we will put it in our stories so folks can find it. But I'll put your website and our link tree. I think it's actually right there. Molly, any organizing folks in the Pacific Northwest, you want to plug them in?
Oh, I get involved in something that's necessarily like politics. You can do get involved on a local grassroots level. I'm part of the National LGBTQ Workers Center that really tries to organize folks, who union members and union members. Those workers are also important.
Ernesto, immigration taking interns? No.
Yeah. We always are. And then the interns do a fantastic work, and they publish blogs that we edit, that we work with. So go to immigrationlab.org and look at the blog. Students are also publishing, self and others publishing blogs. Check that out. I also have a book that just came out with a student called Immigration Realities that talks about dispelling some of these myths that immigrants commit crime, that the border is dangerous. Look at it in a very accessible, easy to understand, not lingo. It's for a wide. So if you have some the defense about migration that is something that I can open to learn more about the actual realities, that could be a good book. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you everyone.
Thank you all for tuning in, for staying so long. I appreciate you.